The desert was quiet until a sack twitched beneath the flies. Inside, a little girl barely clinging to life whispered one word, "Papa." Mason Rourke wasn't anyone's father. He wasn't even a man folks trusted with a second look. But in that moment, he did something dangerous. He cared. Now he's got a child in his arms, a mob at his back, and a secret buried deeper than any grave in Mercy Hollow. Because this girl isn't just a victim, she's proof. The sun burned low, a copper disk bleeding into the jagged horizon, painting the gulch in bruised purples and bruised silence. Wind stirred the dry mesquite like breath through a dying man's lips. Flies hovered thick near the lip of the arroyo, drunk on something the earth hadn't finished swallowing. There, half swallowed by red dust and thornbrush, sagged a burlap sack tied at the neck with frayed twine, bloated strangely, like something inside it still fought for space. A cough, wet and small. Then came the voice. "Papa." The wind didn't carry it, it cut through it. A whisper frayed by thirst and dust and something worse, hope. Mason Rourke reined in without thinking. Before we show you why a child left in a sack called a stranger Papa, what the town of Mercy Hollow tried to bury beneath law and silence, and how one worn coat became a shield against a mob's wrath, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories, they're reckonings, whispered between thunder and judgment. Your support helps us ride farther into forgotten trails, unearth voices meant to vanish, and honor those who chose mercy over survival. One click keeps these legends breathing. Thank you for riding with us. His horse, a lean black mare named Belle, shuddered under him, ears swiveling. He shifted his weight in the saddle, eyes narrowing toward the edge of the drop where the buzzing clustered thickest. Nothing should have made that sound. Not from a sack. Not way out here, miles from Mercy Hollow. Not after sundown. He slid from the saddle. The click of his boots on stone was a metronome against the hush. His hand dropped to the Colt on his hip, habit more than threat, but he drew it all the same. This part of the world didn't offer favors. It laid traps. A child's voice, out here, was a riddle with teeth behind it. Belle stomped once, restless. "Stay," Mason muttered. Then louder, to the silence, "Who's there?" The wind answered. Then silence. Then again, broken like glass. "Papa." He crouched low, eyes scanning the terrain. Tracks not fresh, wagons maybe two, heading east. Bootprints, small ones, drag marks. Then the sack, stinking faintly of old milk and copper, twitched. Mason froze. Another sound now. Not a voice, a breath. The kind that drags up from the pit of a chest too small to hold much more of it. He holstered the Colt, knelt beside the sack. Flies lifted in a cloud, parting like black mist. He reached for the twine, then hesitated. Something about the way it was tied, like it wasn't meant to be opened again. One pull. The knot gave. He peeled the burlap back slow, like unwrapping a nightmare. Inside, dirt-smeared skin, tangled hair, lips cracked and blue. A girl, no more than 5. Eyes open, barely. Her hands were tied, rope burns around both wrists. She blinked once, slow, uneven. Mason's voice came low. "You alive, little one?" Her mouth moved, no sound came out. Then, with a rattle in her chest that sounded final, she whispered again, "Papa." She reached for his coat with a hand that shook like dry paper. He didn't speak, didn't breathe. Just knelt there, the desert pressing in from all sides, heat rising off the rocks like ghosts. Behind him, the sky cracked with a single sheet of lightning. A storm was coming. The kind that turned trails to rivers and dust to mud, the kind that erased things. Mason Rourke wrapped the girl in his coat, lifting her light as bones. Somewhere behind him, something rustled, too slow for a rabbit, too deliberate for wind. But he didn't look back. His eyes were on the girl. She'd been left for the coyotes. Now she clung to him like he was salvation. And God help whoever had done this. The sun beat down on Mercy Hollow like a curse, baking the wood of the storefronts until it groaned, peeling paint in long, tired strips. Dust rolled in waves across the boardwalks, and the only relief came in the form of warm beer and cooler lies traded inside the saloon. Mason Rourke didn't bother with either. He slipped down the main drag silent as shadow, a bundle of cured pelts over his shoulder and sweat drawing a dark collar around his faded shirt. He didn't like towns. Too many eyes, too many mouths, too many men with too little to lose and too much to prove. But he needed salt, ammunition, a sharpening stone. That meant Mercy Hollow. Whether he liked it or not, he traded at the outfitter's stall, avoiding the clerk's attempts at talk. Coins exchanged hands, nods substituted for words. Mason kept his hat low, his distance lower. Then he saw her. At first, she blended into the scenery like a discarded rag doll, just another shape in the heat haze, slumped against the splintered hitch post outside the general store. But her eyes, those were sharp, unnervingly so. Watching him, unblinking. She was no older than 5. Dirt crusted in the creases of her elbows, her knees. Rope circled her middle, tied crudely to the iron ring on the post. Her dress hung in tatters, more threadbare than cloth. One sandal was missing, the other was 2 sizes too big. He might have walked past. Should have. But her gaze followed him, steady and strange. Like she recognized him. Or maybe just recognized something in him, hunger, maybe. Or silence. He paused at the well, drawing water into his canteen, eyes flicking back to the girl. No one else looked at her. They walked around her like she wasn't there, like she was part of the post, the dirt, the heat. A woman exited the general store with a bag of flour, nearly brushed the child's arm. Didn't flinch, didn't blink. Mason took a longer look. Bruises, faint yellow-green blooming under one eye. A scab on her temple, rope burns on both wrists. She shifted in the shade, the movement revealing a sack lying just behind the post, empty, coarse, the kind used for storing feed or garbage. But this one had smudges on the inside, red-brown, something that wasn't entirely old. His jaw clenched. He wasn't here for trouble. Wasn't here to pick at scars that didn't belong to him. Still, his hand drifted to the brim of his hat. He gave the girl the smallest nod, like 2 ghosts passing on the same lonely road. She nodded back. Didn't smile. Didn't cry. Didn't say a word. Inside the saloon, laughter cracked like a whip. The clink of bottles, the rasp of boots on old pine. Life went on. The girl blinked slow, eyes never leaving Mason's retreating form as he turned back down the boardwalk. He should have kept walking, should have, but her eyes burned into the back of his skull. Something about her didn't belong to this place. And something about this place didn't want her to leave. The storm rolled in with a growl, low and long, like something waking up angry beneath the horizon. Mason Rourke sat beneath the overhang of a bluff just outside town, fingers working a whetstone across the edge of his knife, the motion steady, ritualistic. The flint hissed against steel. Thunder grumbled. He kept his eyes on the blade, but his mind, traitorous as it was, wandered. She'd watched him. Not with fear, not exactly. More like recognition. That haunted kind. The kind that looks out from behind 2 small ribs and too many empty nights. He'd seen that look before. In mirrors, in graves. In the eyes of men who'd buried too much too young. He didn't know her story. Didn't want to. Nothing good came from getting close. The law in Mercy Hollow was a patchwork of piety and cruelty, depending on the hour and who had the rope. Children tied to posts didn't raise eyebrows, they raised silence. He told himself that twice. Then a 3rd time, just to make sure. Wind kicked up dirt at the mouth of the bluff, and Belle, tied nearby, tossed her head. Mason looked up. The sky had gone the color of old bruises. Lightning flashed distantly. The air shifted sharper, charged. He poured a sip of water down his throat, the canteen's metal cool in his calloused hand. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was wind sliding through the rocks. Then again clearer this time, uncanny in the stillness between thunderclaps. "Papa." The knife slipped. A thin line opened across his knuckle. He stared at it, blood beating like it couldn't decide whether to run. "Papa." He stood. Belle was already pawing at the ground, keyed up, ears forward. Mason swung into the saddle without thinking. The whetstone lay forgotten in the dust. He rode hard. Mercy Hollow blurred past, lanterns already doused, shutters latched against the coming storm. The boardwalks were empty, the night a hush of warning. He turned east, toward the edge of town where the general store sat dark. No sign of the girl. The hitch post stood bare, no rope, no sack. Something cold twisted in his gut. He found tracks in the dirt shallow wagon ruts, one set, heading toward the gulch. Sloppy, fast, in a hurry to be gone. Rain began to spit. He followed. The storm moved in overhead, angry and electric. Lightning tore across the sky, flashing the world in brief, stark truths. The trail narrowed, curved down into the dry ravine where water used to run. The wagon had bounced, left deeper impressions. A broken piece of wood, a wheel spoke, lay half buried near a mesquite shrub. Then he saw it. The faintest stain, dark, not yet washed by the rain. Blood. Belle skidded down the slope, hooves struggling for grip on the wet rock. Mason dismounted before she could falter, moving on foot now, crouched low, rifle unslung. "Papa." It came again. But this time not from behind. Ahead. He surged forward. Another flash lit the arroyo like a god's lantern, and there, at the far edge, something moved. A shape, limp, half covered by a fallen tarp. No wagon, no driver. Just the smell of rain and rust, and the growing, unbearable quiet of the desert when it's about to remember how to kill. Time was running out. The tarp clung to the rocks like a wet shroud, rippling under the storm's breath. Mason knelt beside it, pulse pounding louder than the thunder. His fingers dug through the edge of the fabric, and underneath coarse burlap, soaked and darkened at the seams. The same sack, twine still knotted at the neck. He slit it with his knife. Inside, silence first. Then a whisper of movement. A small arm, thin as bone, reached out blindly, fingers twitching like a dying flame. The girl's face was turned toward the dirt, caked in it. Her lips were cracked open, barely. Her breath when it came rattled like wind in a dead chimney. "Hey," Mason rasped. He touched her shoulder. She flinched, then looked up. Those same eyes. And then she whispered it again, slower this time, like it was the only word she had left. "Papa." She reached out, fist clenching weakly in the fabric of his duster. Wouldn't let go. Couldn't. Mason stood, lifting her against his chest. She weighed nothing. Less than nothing. A bird with hollow bones and a heartbeat you had to pray to feel. The sky cracked open with lightning so close it turned the world white. Belle danced in the wash at the ravine's edge. Mason crossed the gulch fast, boots slipping on wet stone. The girl held tight. She didn't speak again, but her grip held fingers twisted deep in the worn coat like they knew it, like she'd dreamt of it. He got her on the horse, wrapped in his coat. Climbed up behind her, guiding Belle back toward the rise. That's when he saw them. Buzzards. 3, then 4. Circling wide above the path he'd just come, waiting for the storm to finish what the sack had started. And below the ridge movement. Figures. One man at first, on foot. Then 2 more on horses. Shadows against the lightning, but unmistakable. Watching. One raised a lantern. The others had rifles slung. Not townfolk, not exactly, but not strangers either. Mason urged Belle faster. By the time he hit the edge of town, she was burning. Her breath came shallow. She moaned once, clutching his coat like it might disappear. He carried her into the abandoned stable behind the old blacksmith's shop, half collapsed, forgotten, safer than the saloon. He laid her on dry hay, checked her pulse. Weak, but there. He wiped the mud from her face with his bandana. She looked up at him again, eyes glassy, lips forming the same word. Papa. His throat closed. Behind the stable, the wind carried voices. Low at first, but growing. Accusations riding the storm. Men shouting. Hooves striking dirt. Not aimless. Coming for him. Somebody had seen. Somebody had told. In a town like Mercy Hollow, a child didn't belong to herself. She was property, wards, orphans, collateral. A man who took one even to save her might as well have robbed a church. Mason stood at the stable's threshold, revolver heavy on his hip, rain sluicing from his hat brim. The noose was tightening. And this time, it had a name. The storm had broken by dawn, but the sky still hung heavy, low and bruised, like it hadn't made up its mind whether to end the fight or reload. Devil's Spine Ridge carved a jagged scar across the horizon, wind slicing across the shale like a whetted blade. Mason Rourke stood at the highest point, boots planted wide, the girl wrapped in his coat and cradled in one arm. She was quieter now, breathing shallow against his chest, her fingers still knotted in the lapel like roots hanging on for life. Below, they came. First, the riders, 3 abreast, faces half-shadowed beneath wide brims. Then the townsmen on foot, some with shovels, others with shotguns. A wagon trailed behind, rattling with every bump in the path. At its helm sat a man in black with a silver cross around his neck and a rolled paper in his hand, a law writ, no doubt freshly inked and half-righteous. The preacher's eyes locked on Mason with a look that mistook cruelty for justice. "She's not yours," the preacher said, voice echoing sharp across the open ridge. "You've taken something you don't understand." She was being corrected, not condemned. Mason didn't flinch. She was left to die in a sack. The preacher raised the writ. "By church sanction and community vote. Her bloodline is cursed. You don't know what that child is." "She called me Papa," Mason said, quiet but firm. "Maybe that means something." A murmur passed through the crowd like a gust before the storm's second wave. The townsfolk weren't a single body, they were factions held together by fear and familiarity. But fractures showed. A few stepped back. Some looked down. "She belongs with her people," the preacher insisted. "She belongs breathing," Mason snapped. That's when the boy stepped forward. Barely 15, straw hair and trembling knees, the kind of ranch hand they never paid proper and never fed enough. He looked up at Mason, then back at the preacher, then out at the faces behind him, people he knew, people he feared. "I saw what they did," the boy said, voice shaking. "I was loading the grain sacks. She wasn't screaming. Not when they tied her, not when they kicked her." The crowd hushed. "She didn't cry," he went on, softer now. "Not until they drove off and left her behind." Someone muttered a curse. Another lowered their shotgun. The preacher's lips thinned. "That child is an omen. You think saving her will undo what's been written?" Mason stepped forward, the girl against his chest barely moving, her breath like smoke in the cold morning air. "I don't give a damn what's been written. I know what I heard." He looked down at her. She stirred just slightly. Her fingers tightened on his coat. "Papa." That's what she said. The wind held still for a beat. The kind of silence that tilts history one way or the other. What would you do? Leave her to the law? Or defy it to save her life? The standoff hung like a drawn breath, every man on the ridge waiting to see who'd move first. The preacher gripping his law writ like a sword of righteousness, the boy still trembling in the open, and Mason Rourke, coat flapping in the wind, holding the child like she was the last good thing on this side of the line. Then came the sound that turned heads and stiffened backs, the low, deliberate thunder of hooves, not fast like a charge but steady like judgment. Dust kicked up behind the ridgeline as the cavalry emerged. Blue coats. Union issue, not fresh off war, but not yet softened by peace either. And at their center, astride a pale buckskin with brass fittings and too much polish, rode Sheriff Holler. The man didn't belong to the town, not really. He belonged to what came after the rebuilding, the paper law, the cold efficiency of keeping people in line even if it meant breaking them first. His badge caught the light like a blade. His mustache was trimmed to perfection, his gaze cool and unreadable. He raised a hand. The Union men halted. "Mercy Hollow's been stirring," he said, not loud but clear enough to cut through the wind. "Folk arguing about a child, about right and wrong, about things that go better unspoken." No one replied. The preacher lowered his writ, suddenly deferential. Holler turned his eyes to Mason. "I hear you picked up something that wasn't yours." Mason didn't move. "She was left to die." "Some would say that was a decision made by her people," Holler replied. "Some would say that interfering with it's a kind of theft." "She's breathing," Mason said. "Barely. That ought to matter." The sheriff sighed like a man enduring the stupidity of others. "Look, son, I've got a town full of jumpy farmers, 2 dead cattle from last week they already think was her doing, and a preacher spreading talk of curses. What I need is quiet. You understand?" Mason's eyes narrowed. "You here to enforce the law or hush the town?" "I'm here to prevent escalation." Holler's smile was thin and tired. "Hand over the girl. She'll be delivered to the county seat. Judge'll sort it out. Clean, official." "That judge still drinkin' with your brother?" Mason asked. A flicker crossed Holler's face. "Just a flicker. But enough." "I'll chalk that to stress," the sheriff said. The girl stirred. Her voice came again, rasping and dry. "Papa." It was louder this time, heard by more. Holler looked at the child, looked at the crowd behind him. The townsfolk weren't shouting anymore. They were watching, waiting. A few looked ashamed. A few looked unsure. That was worse. Uncertainty bred questions. Questions bred fire. "I need this over," Holler said. "Now, hand her over, Mason." But Mason didn't move. And somewhere in the dust, behind the silent riders, a single man unhooked his rifle. Not aiming. Yet. The ridge had shifted. Mason Rourke wasn't just a nuisance now. He was a symbol. And the sheriff couldn't afford symbols. The ridge stilled. Wind dropped. Even the horses grew uneasy, hooves shifting against stone like they knew something unnatural hovered in the space between heartbeats. The girl clung to Mason's chest, her breath rasping against his collar. Her skin was hot, her fingers like kindling light, but burning up from within. He knelt slowly, bringing her down to his knee, letting her lean back just enough to draw air. Her lips moved, cracked and dry, but this time the whisper didn't fade into wind. "Sophie," she said. A name like a key turning in a rusted lock. Mason looked at her. Not just looked, saw. The curve of her jaw. The pale streak in her hair. The edge of something old and fragile in the shape of her nose. He didn't know who she was before, but now she wasn't just a child left behind. She was someone with a name, a history. Then her hand reached into his coat. He stiffened for a moment, then saw what she pulled free. A ragged cloth doll, stitched from burlap and faded thread, its head lopsided, one eye missing. A small bow was tied to what was once its neck. Faded letters were stitched in crude but loving hands across the hem of the doll's dress. 3 initials. E.L.H. Holler's face changed. Not confusion. Recognition. His mouth tightened like he'd bitten a nail. His horse shifted, sensing the sudden spike in its rider's tension. "She found this," Mason said, his voice low but carried by the stillness. "Was in the sack with her. No one spoke. But eyes moved to Holler, to the doll, then back again. She said her name is Sophie, Mason continued, holding the doll up. Same name as Eleanor's stillborn, wasn't it? Your daughter's first. Holler's hand twitched near his sidearm. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Mason stood slow, not reaching for his gun, just holding the girl close again. Funny thing, that doll's stitched with the same thread Eleanor used when she ran the hospice tent at Vicksburg. I remember it. My brother was there. You shut your mouth. She was your kin, Mason said, stepping forward. And you let them throw her in a sack because it was easier than explaining why your daughter left town with a stomach too round and a preacher too interested. Holler snapped. He spurred the buckskin forward, hand snatching out to grab the child. She doesn't belong to you. Mason moved faster. His arm blocked Holler's reach, his body turning just enough to shelter Sophie behind his coat. Holler's horse reared. A flash of movement, one of the townsmen raising a rifle in panic. A shot cracked. Mason didn't fall. But Holler did. The sheriff jerked in the saddle, then slid sideways, landing hard in the red dust. The crowd gasped, not in grief, but in disbelief. Blood seeped through his coat just below the ribs. Rifle still smoking, the ranch boy who had stepped forward earlier now trembled behind the preacher. His eyes wide, his hands shaking. I thought he was gonna... The preacher stepped back, lips pressed thin. No one moved to help Holler. Mason knelt again, arms around the girl. She held the doll now, pressed against her chest, and from behind the silence, the town began to shift. Truth had come unstitched, and it would not be tied up again. The storm had passed, but the air in Ash Tree Hollow remained heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. The dirt was dark and wet beneath boots, the scent of scorched mesquite still lingering from the lightning strike that had split an old tree in half 2 nights prior. That tree now lay broken at the edge of the churchyard, its roots exposed like ribs. No one moved it, no one spoke of it. They just gathered beneath its shadow. The townspeople came in 2s and 3s, eyes wary, voices low. The steps of the church creaked under their weight. Rain-soaked hats were held in hand, rifles slung but not forgotten. There were no courtrooms in Mercy Hollow, no judges in powdered wigs. Just the hollow, the preacher's word, and the weight of eyes, too many that had seen, too many that had stayed quiet. Sophie stood beside Mason, her tiny hand clasped in his, though she trembled less now. The fever had broken. Her skin, though pale, had begun to warm. The coat still hung off her frame like armor. No rope, no sack, no bruises left untouched. Someone Mason didn't know who had washed her face. She looked like a child again, not a question mark wrapped in burlap. Reverend Tull stood on the top step, law writ still tucked into his coat, its seal muddied and meaningless now. His voice came gravelly, thinner than before. There's no trial, no marshal, just us. And her, and the truth. He nodded to the ranch hand, the boy who had pulled the trigger that ended Holler's silence. The boy stepped forward, wringing his cap in nervous hands. I didn't mean to shoot, I swear, but I seen what they did. She never screamed, just took it, like she expected it. He glanced down at her, then at Mason. But when he picked her up, when she said Papa, that's the only time I ever saw her sound like she wanted to live. Next came the preacher's wife. She shook her head slowly as she stepped forward. They said she was cursed, born of sin. But I held her once before they took her from Eleanor's arms. That was a child, not a warning. Her eyes turned sharp. A lie told often enough becomes gospel. Doesn't mean it's holy. Even the barkeep came. Cracked voice, whiskey-stained fingers. She used to sneak in my back door for scraps. Didn't speak, just nodded and smiled. I never said nothing. Figured she'd vanish like they all do, but she didn't. They looked to Mason next, but he said nothing. Instead, Sophie stepped forward. She didn't speak loud, didn't have to. "I'm not bad," she said, voice thin but steady. "I remember music, a yellow room, a doll." She lifted it up, frayed, stained, but held like a flag. "My name is Sophie." It wasn't a speech, it was a fact. The preacher folded his hands behind his back. "She bears no sin, nor shame." Someone coughed, someone else sniffed. The weight shifted. The circle closed not around Mason, not even around the town. Around her. She was no longer the girl in the sack. She was standing. And no one would put her back in silence again. Dawn broke slow over the high ridges, the kind of morning that crept rather than rose, pale gold light filtering through a ragged sky still bruised from the storm. The ground steamed where the sun touched it, mud sucking at hoofprints, last night's rain turning the trail into a series of quiet traps. But Mason didn't push the pace. The road north wasn't about speed. It was about motion, about not looking back. Sophie sat in the saddle ahead of him, wrapped in a blanket someone from the church had pressed into his hands before they left. Her small fingers gripped the reins with a seriousness that made Mason hide a smile behind the brim of his hat. She wasn't guiding the horse. Belle still took her cue from the weight of Mason's legs, but she thought she was. That mattered more. The doll was tucked in her belt, like a deputy's badge. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Her fever had broken, her voice grown steadier, but the weight of the days behind them hadn't loosened yet. That would come, or it wouldn't. Either way, Mason figured they had time. And space. The kind that heals, or at least makes the wound easier to carry. The trail wound through lowland scrub. Then climbed toward open fields, where the grass still held rainwater like silver threads. Birds sang in cautious bursts. Somewhere far behind, Mercy Hollow was waking up without a sheriff, without a child tied to a post, without a lie left festering in a feed sack. Sophie turned her head. "Do we have a home?" she asked. Mason didn't answer right away. He studied the sky. Thought of a cabin long abandoned on the other side of the Bitterroot Range. Thought of a fire that hadn't been lit in years. "Not yet," he said finally, "but maybe we'll build one." She nodded like that was acceptable. Like that made sense. He didn't ask about her memories. Not yet. He didn't press about the yellow room, the music, the mother she saw in dreams. That would come. Or it wouldn't. Stories surfaced in their own time, and children, he'd learned, were better at burying pain than most men were at surviving it. The sun climbed higher. The mud clung to Belle's hooves, pulling at her stride, but she didn't complain. Neither did Mason. Some roads were meant to be slow. Some storms didn't leave just because the sky cleared. Up ahead, the land stretched wide, untamed and unknowable. Sophie leaned back slightly, resting against his chest. "You're not really my papa," she said softly. "No," Mason said, then added, "but I'm here." She nodded again, eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't ask more, didn't need to. The reins stayed in her hands. And in the hush between hoofbeats, the narrator's voice returned, like wind carried across distance, across memory. Sometimes family's what you find in the dark, and sometimes mercy has to ride faster than law. What happens when they meet the mother she remembers? That's a tale for another fire.